Very, very humble to be, to following Glynis there, very humble indeed. And I think it highlights something that I want to raise in my sort of presentation, is that it's about, we need to change the rhetoric from choice, to choice and not chance. It's not about chance in the social welfare system, it's about choices. And the key thing that I'm bringing today is from work that I've been doing with demographers across Europe. And demographers study populations, and as a result of a European-wide project on families and societies, one of the key outcomes that has come from that is that we've set up an international study group looking at lone parents across Europe. This study is being carried out by the Swiss National Centre on Lone Parenthood, the University of Antwerp, and Population Europe in Berlin. Population Europe is the Institute of Demographers, i.e. all those academics that study populations. And one of the key observations that I have in terms of intergenerational poverty is that children inherit poverty. That's the rhetoric that's coming out. We're seeing, and this is an interesting diagram in terms of the narrative, and we even saw that in terms of growing up in Ireland, that children by their birth, by their genetics, and by choosing the right parents win. Win in terms of the lottery of life. And we need to change that. We need to change that so that it's not just about chance, it's about choice. And we need to look at that through this issue of life course perspective. It's true, early interventions shape later life, but all our lives are linked. And what we're seeing across Europe as well is the transfer of public responsibility for health, education, welfare being transferred to the family. It's been individualized. The state is taking a less role in terms of services and supports to ensure that there is it's less chance and more choice. So growing up in poverty limits individual potential. We can see that. It reduces economic prosperity, but it also increases the social costs in later in people's lives. It's social protection, health, hospital services, social assistance, opportunity and aspiration. We're in a society where we talk about innovation, aspiration, the future, yet we're seeing services and supports limiting that aspiration in terms of children. So my next slide, really, in the unusual sort of issue there, I'm going to put up the solutions at the beginning and then give you the story behind those solutions. What we need to do, particularly in Ireland, is I think measure the gap between the average child and the child near the bottom in those measures of poverty. There's no point in just producing these poverty statistics. We need to measure the gap in that and examine what really makes that gap greater. We also need to examine how children fare and because of their falling behind in terms of both material well-being, educational achievement and physical health. And we need to look at the interactions of that. There's no point, again, in giving simple statistical descriptive reporting. It's more important to analyse these things and measure and compare how they interact. It was very interesting this morning that, in the talk, it's always, the rhetoric in terms of a lot of policy analysis is about community services, community health. Not public services or public health. They're always very afraid to talk about universal public health. And that's what works. That's what works in the Nordic models. That's what works. I'm based in Prague now. That's what works in Central Europe as well. And government's action is the key to reducing child poverty. It's not about having cash transfers. It's not about creating schemes and systems, and it's not about labour market. It's about providing services that support parents to work, to support parents in education, and to support parents that stay at home. Childcare is not just about parents out working. Childcare is about children having respite from parents as well, you know, and for their social development. So let's look at this in terms of a European perspective. In terms of, there's 80 million people at risk of poverty in Europe. There's 40 million people in low work intensity, i.e., very part-time jobs, low income, precarious employment. And 40 million people across Europe materially deprived. So poverty is a huge issue in Europe. And poverty is a huge issue for states to look at and actually to do something. Child poverty, and this is from OECD statistics, Nordic countries and Netherlands, 7%. The lowest in Europe is Iceland. Iceland went through a financial crisis. They got rid of the bankers, and now, they're prospering. But, poverty in Iceland, okay, it's a small state, but it's only 5%. They deal with that in a very creative way. Canada, Australia, United Kingdom around about 10-15%. Ireland, 18%. Ireland, and that is increasing and is going towards the European model where there's no services in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, where there are no services and supports because they don't have that tradition of public services. Ireland's moving to that and transferring responsibility for those services to families. So let's look at this. And, people that know me, I talk constantly about education and the role of education. But education provides people with choices. That's what's important for choices in people's life. But what does that education mean? Well, education means earnings. Without education, it's a creation of income inequality. Education gives a gateway to access to life chances and choices. Education gives you power. It gives you power to argue. It gives you power to make discourse. And education does actually help to reduce inequality in terms of class, although we don't like to talk about class in Ireland. We tend to say that we're a classless society. Education gives us issues to talk about gender, and it also gives us how we talk and the language we use. And these are the influences, I think, are the key elements there in terms of poverty and intergenerational poverty. But let's look at this in terms of the persistence in terms of education and inequality. About 80% of total income inequality is explained away by wage inequality. What we're seeing in Ireland is the differentiation between the low paid and the high paid. That gap is increasing. That gap is increasing quite dramatically. So labour, income is a major issue in terms of poverty. We can also see in terms of access to capital, access to funding, to buy a house, to support people. And actually the transfer of capital from parents to children is a major issue these days. And that really relates to aspects about inheritance. Rich kids inherit. I mean, we're seeing that, in the discourse, in the Twitter discourse with Donald Trump at the moment, and Donald Trump Jr. about inheritance. And it also, there's an element there about those aspects about social networks as well. We're seeing that formal patronage, nepotism, etc., plays an important role in how children move forward, what school you went to, what your parents did. It's very hard to become a successful lawyer without actually being from inheriting inheriting the aspects from your father or mother. So what we're seeing there is that low quality education leads to low social mobility and hereditary poverty. And I think that's one of the key things that we need to talk about in terms of intergenerational poverty, is inheritance of poverty, and using that discourse because it's something that people will actually connect to. Just to explain this a little, to take this a bit further forward, is that in order to evolve that, we need to look at developing well-informed family policies. Because I'm not going to go through these in detail because I think they're issues that we all know about. But, self-sufficient, wealthy and resilient families. Yes, we all want that. But how do we create that? How do we put that in place? What's the role of the state in putting that in place? Better work-family balance. Everybody's talking about work-life balance and that, but work-life balance is a chance issue. It's not a choice for everybody. People in low, precarious employment have no opportunity to look at work-life balance at all. So we can see that there's the interaction there between education and health as well. It creates this imbalance that we have in terms of society. The next slide you won't be able to read, but I always put a lot of information on slides because it tells a story and they're for circulation afterwards. But if we have to get back to basics on these things and looking at certain issues about what causes poverty in the first place. Governments have the ability to make those choices to change poverty. It's not an aspect of policy that we really talk about all the time. We had an organisation, we had a campaign about ending child poverty in Ireland. I'm afraid that's dissipated. And where has that gone? Where we've talked about earlier this morning of the coalition of NGOs coming together and really fighting, as similar as they did with marriage equality, about changing the aspects of poverty. We need to look at these as well. Again, too much information on the slide, but one-parent families represent 10 to 15% of family formations across Europe. So they're a significant minority across Europe, and they're a significant force to change. Again, it's one of those aspects that I remember when working in Ireland about encouraging one-parent families to get out and vote, particularly in a lot of marginal constituencies, because they were significant, had significant voting power in order to change parties' policies and parties' aspects. But we can see there that if I give you an example, in Prague, where I live, 50% of children are in one-parent families. But the public services are there in order to support those parents going out to work, going into education. Childcare is public, after-school care is public. So the services are there in order to achieve that. Also, the big issue in terms of the Czech Republic as well, that healthcare is free, GP visits are free, and prescriptions are minimum cost, and they're controlled by the state. So it makes these things, in terms of life chances, much more radiant. So what are the issues about one-parent families? One-parent families, the challenges are not related to the family structure, but to the socio-cultural processes and the lacking of support for those families. That's the key issue in terms of one-parent families. It's not because they're just one parent. It's because the resources are not necessarily there in order to support. Again, we have gender, we've talked about stereotypes in terms of parents and families. Gender stereotypes tend to stop women from pursuing careers. Women are carers. That's the sort of stereotype that's really promoted, and it's that across Europe. There's also insufficient support for shared parenting or parental collaborations. That's one of the key issues when parental conflict is taking place. The support networks and the support systems that relate to mediation, or even what Louise is going to talk about later on in terms of maintenance, those systems are not in place. In the Czech Republic, if the absent parent does not pay maintenance, their driver's license is taken from them. So, that is a huge incentive in terms of paying your maintenance contribution. It's a simple thing to do, but it's effective. So, what are the consequences? Well, what we're seeing is the consequences, and this is across Europe as well. Impaired health of parents and children living in poverty. Higher risk of psychomotor development. Higher risk of resilience not being developed. Worse school outcomes. Physical and emotional well-being and peer relationships of single parents are being reduced because of these stresses. And what we're seeing in an intergenerational aspect there, aggravated female poverty in old age. Because the opportunities of not being able to make contributions to pensions, contributions in terms of career development, contributions in terms of skills. So these are, very clear consequences. Just wanted to say this, splitting up or getting divorced can be one of the most difficult and stressful events a family can go through, okay? And what I did as an exercise, I just mapped all the stressors. There's the impact of separation and divorce, the practicalities, okay? It's all things, debt, insurance, medical, childcare, wills, parenting, housing. Let's look at, impact of separation. Let's map all that onto the impact of the child. A huge issue. I mean, for me, it's a very visual representation of the stresses, what that means. And if a child is experiencing and going through that, then their life chances and life opportunities are severely compromised. So it's important, as I said, that we need to look at the life course perspective. Everything's about the web these days. So let's look at the web of life and the interactions and the communications in terms of life. We need to look at the larger influences on family, the macro influences. And we need to begin to understand the mental and physical and social health aspects. It's interesting enough that the UK government at the moment is beginning to look at mental health, because it's having a huge impact in terms of the stressors of the British economy. It's a small point, but it's a good thing that they're beginning to look at that. Mental health has always been the sidelined and put outside the discussions of every other social policy. Yes. Yeah, okay. I'll skip through. Yeah. I think one of what I wanted to do is that in terms of Ireland is that in the past Ireland has a chopped up approach to social policy. It's been destructive, it's not been constructive. We need to look at things in an interrelated, and it's something that I've gone on about for a number of years. We need to look at it in an outcome-based budgeting process. If you're going to reduce child poverty, then child poverty is an issue not just for the Department of Social Protection and Employment. It's an issue for health. It's an issue for enterprise. It's an issue for foreign affairs. It's an issue for budget reform, etc. And we need to see that as a goal. Otherwise, we're going to end up I'm going to end up coming here and giving the same talk 5-10 years down the line, and everybody else is. We need to learn from our challenges, and we need to learn both in an active way and a way that can reinforce better outcomes for children and better outcomes for families. Thank you.